Welcome to Pick Up and Deliver, the podcast where I pick up my audio recorder when I head out for a walk and deliver an episode to you while I stroll around. I'm Brendan Riley. Well, good morning, good afternoon, listeners. It is the second half of my walk that I started in the last episode when I did the shooting from the hip triple shot. It's cloudy and gloomy, but a lovely day altogether. And I'm happy to be talking to you from my neighborhood. Hey listeners, Future Brendan here. I was walking home from a store doing this podcast, and at the beginning I was going through a urban area where I was passing people, so I had my mask on. And I frankly forgot that I had it on. So the first half of this podcast will sound a bit muffled, but I think it sounds okay, so I'm going to leave it as is. Apologies if you find it bothersome. I realized that I was wearing my mask about halfway through the podcast, or 2/3. So toward the end, I'll be speaking normally. I'm on my way home from the game store, having picked up Praga Kaput Regni, the new Vladimir Suhi game that I have been excited for since they announced it months ago, and it finally is available here in America, and I got my copy. I'm very excited. It's heavy. If you hear me exhausted and falling down, it's because Praga Kaput Regni is full of cardboard and very heavy, but I'm excited to play it. So let's see what there is to share. Just today, or just yesterday, some interesting news and sad news has emerged in the board game community that seems to be causing all kinds of ruckus. And this is an interview done by Daniele Tascini of the Italian design group that has done a number of games, including Zolkin and Teotihuacan, and there's a new one, something Obelisk of the Sun. And it turns out that Tascini holds or expresses significantly racist views. Now, I will say, this is all secondhand. I haven't gone and read the interview yet, so I'm not going to comment necessarily on Tascini himself or the views that he takes, because I haven't gone and read the article. What I'm interested in is the discussion around the article and the discussion around what's happening in board games. So this isn't something that I've seen happen a whole lot. I mean, there certainly are people who have odious views in board games. Phil Eklund's view about how biology works comes to mind. And I tend to fall on the more liberal side of the political spectrum, as I'm sure you know from listening to this podcast. What I'm interested in is talking about how our community talks about this sort of thing. The one other time that I've seen something like this emerge was maybe 2 years ago. A game developer came out and indicated that another prominent game developer had been particularly abusive and had used their employment in board gaming as a tool in perpetuating that abuse. The publicity around this resulted in a lot of people stopping interactions with that game designer, and as far as I know, they're not working on game work anymore. This seems to be the direction that things are going with Daniele Tascini. I know Board and Dice has released a statement saying that they're no longer going to pursue any projects with him, and that any profits they make from games he published will go to anti-racist causes. I saw at least one other company that's worked with him saying they're not going to work with him anymore, but asking people not to punish all the other people involved in the game by stopping buying them, which is an interesting move. Over on Board Game Geek, the conversation is, as one might expect, predictably fractious. There are a fair number of people complaining about quote-unquote cancel culture. And this is the thing that I'm interested in. The conversation about cancel culture in board games, as opposed to the conversation about being welcoming. Now, my sense of the conversation about being welcoming is that there are two approaches to that conversation. On the less progressive or less outgoing side are the people who say, hey, board games are perfectly welcoming. Come on in if you want to join. and who then do not acknowledge or recognize or converse about experiences people have that feel less than welcoming. By contrast, there are people who listen to stories about board gaming being less welcoming and have called for greater efforts to make board gaming a space where everybody feels welcome to join. So when a prominent game designer does an interview in which they express racist views, the response of the community resonates with the conversations about the community's ability or efforts to be welcoming. If you are a person targeted by those racist views, or you're a person who just finds them abhorrent, discovering a community where people expressing those views are tolerated and welcomed is itself anti-welcoming. And so it sort of begs the question to me of what it means to complain about quote-unquote cancel culture and what cancel culture would mean in the first place. I think there are two kinds of activities that happen that people will call cancel culture. And I've certainly heard, like, my daughter use the word canceled to talk about public campaigns against supporting individuals who have done something they shouldn't. That often individuals will make some sort of faux pas, either a significant one or a minor one, and some percentage of the community will advocate for that person to lose their visibility in a variety of different media platforms, be it Instagram or Snapchat or whatever. And I think that the advocacy for losing their visibility comes from telling people not to support that social media person anymore, and then ad calls for commercial supporters of them to withdraw. The goal being, of course, to cancel that person's public spot. Now, this has always been part of the free exchange of ideas, right? That if you express an odious idea, some percentage of the audience will express disgust with that idea, and you'll lose that audience. So I'm not really sure where the complaint about cancel culture comes from. I mean, part of it might be the internet's native ability to spread ideas very quickly. And we all know that, to pull from Letterkenny here, bad gas travels fast in a small town. And the internet is basically a huge small town. So when something bad has happened, or someone says something bad has happened, we're often quick to perpetuate that commentary in ways that we're not nearly so quick to say good things that happen, or even just status quo things. So from one perspective, the internet inherently overreacts to things people do. If you're interested in that, there's a fantastic book by John Ronson called So You've Been Publicly Shamed. And in that book, he talks about several people whose lives and livelihoods have been derailed or ruined or significantly altered because of small mistakes they made on the internet. And here I'm using small in terms of minor things they did, not how significant the error was. For instance, he tells the story of a PR executive who made a tasteless joke about AIDS and Africa to her small group of Twitter followers. And this person apparently normally works in a sarcastic vein, and the joke was sarcastic. But to the average reader, it didn't read sarcastic, it read heartless. And her career was ruined because the internet called her heartless. I think most people see some level of blame to be put on her, but they also recognize an overreaction when they see it. Now, in the case of something like the discussion we're having here, the game designer apparently has doubled down on what they said, refusing to apologize or giving a not apology, and perhaps exacerbating the problem caused by their initial interview. It also starts to beg the question of, like, what good does a self-serving apology do anyway, right? If you've expressed odious views and people call you out for having these odious views and you apologize, does that really make everything right? I've talked about this a little bit before in terms of my own inability to separate the artist from the art, and how learning that an artist has odious views makes it harder to appreciate the art that they've made. I can't imagine that this won't be the case for Tassini, for me, but it'll be interesting to see how much it affects the sales of their games otherwise. The bigger issue, right, is the deplatforming, I think, that their publishers have said we don't want to work with someone who would express these views. Which then begs the question of, will they get to publish games anymore? Will they start their own publishing house in which people who don't mind that issue or don't know about it could support them? Will they find another publishing house that doesn't care so much about that? This is a designer with a big footprint in the board game hobby space has designed several games that are really significant. It's hard to know how the industry and the community will react over time. I mean, in the short term, there's lots of people saying, oh, I'm not going to work with that person anymore. And I trust that many of them are sincere. But it's hard to know in the long term how that might work. I'm also curious, and I'm not advocating here, I'm just curious about what our community's room for growth and reconciliation is. I don't know how Tassini could walk back these comments and demonstrate real growth or change, but I believe in the human power to grow, and I believe in the value of forgiveness. But at the same time, how do you demonstrate that, and how does that play out? And then there's the argument like, well, how does what he thinks matter if his games are good? Shouldn't the games speak for themselves? This is the argument that people make about Roman Polanski and about all sorts of other problematic artists, that their art is not them, and you can enjoy the art. I feel like I'm treading over ground that we've walked on before, so I'm going to move on. But I want to talk a little bit about two other things I've encountered that seem to me to be about making gaming welcoming. I just realized I'm doing this whole podcast with my mask on. I guess we'll see how it sounds. All right, I'm going to stop and take my mask off. Like I said, I was in the store and I had my mask on and I just realized I forgot to take it off. Crap. I may have to bin this whole podcast. Well, that'll be my one concession to COVID. You get half an episode where I'm talking through my mask. Apologies in retrospect. There are two other things that I think come up in the context of making gaming welcoming. The first is the question of fun. A lot of board games aren't really aimed at being fun in the traditional sense. Fun is a light word. It generally encourages the idea of frivolity and silliness and joy. And I find joy in many of the board games that I play. But I freely acknowledge that the things that they're asking me to do, a lot of people wouldn't find to be fun. Over on the So Very Wrong About Board Games podcast, Mark has pointed out that he finds games involving enjoyable accounting tasks to be fun sometimes. I think he calls it pleasurable spreadsheets. Or I know that I'm making an analogy. I know that I'm using homonyms there, but nonetheless. I think it's interesting to consider how that sort of activity maps onto the conversations about fun, right? Just because I find something fun, like, should we reserve the word fun to mean some of those more lighthearted elements like frivolous or joyful or silly? Or can fun have the flexibility to mean brain melting, right? One of my favorite things about a board game is when you want to do something and you just don't quite have enough. Well, when you want to do something and you just don't quite have enough, the answer to that is you have to melt your brain. You have to think really hard. You have to work like the dickens to try to solve this problem. I find that fun, but a lot of people wouldn't call that fun. And I think that the word fun sometimes wouldn't get used that way. People would object to the use of the word fun that way. And I think, so I don't really know where to go with that, except to say that one of the dangers of the board game community is snobbiness. That I think a lot of reviewers don't make this mistake. Somebody like Tom Vassell, or the folks at Shut Up and Sit Down, or the folks at Board Game Barrage, their reviews tend to make room for the idea that new people might be playing and that simple games or accessible games are also very fun. But then there are other people in the hobby who really see the height of board gaming as these grand, complex experiences. And frankly, I'm one of those people, though I am an omni gamer. And it's those grand, complex experiences that make for really interesting games. But they aren't always fun. And I feel like fun is one of those things that, it's very subjective, but I think it is a word that carries a quality that a lot of people aren't thinking about when they think about how they review games. And so then you get things where people promote games that challenge players in ways that new players shouldn't be challenged, or should be warned about what's coming. I think this is where you get into that place where inexperienced people who haven't played very many hobby games will talk about how they didn't like a game because it's too much work. And for me, the effort of doing the work doesn't mean the game isn't fun. In fact, that can be fun. So as I think about how the hobby is welcoming or not, one of the things I think about is, what do we do with the concept of fun? The last thing I wanted to talk about goes to this interesting debate that started on Board Game Geek yesterday exploring the idea of tutorializing. That's a funny word, tutorializing. Basically, this person who posted on Board Game Geek, and I did not write down the username, apologies, they wrote that they were interested in how video games often teach people how to play using a tutorial method. And that tutorial allows players to learn the game slowly and come to understand it without having to spend time reading rule books. And they kind of said, why don't board games do this? The responses were interesting. Some people said they do, and they pointed to companies like Fantasy Flight, who have a separate learn to play booklet that you use, or games that will have you do a tutorial where you walk through a couple turns to learn the game. But I think people made a really important point in discussing the viability of tutorial as a gameplay teaching method, which is that when you play a board game, as opposed to a computer game, the board game cannot keep you from screwing up the rules. When you play a computer game, if you try to do something that's not allowed, it stops you from doing it, if it's well made. I mean, if it's badly made, maybe it doesn't. If you're playing a board game on Tabletop Simulator, you get to make all the mistakes you want. But if you're playing a computer game, or like a computer game version of a board game, like on Board Game Arena, you can't make a mistake. You can make a bad move, and then it sometimes won't let you take them back, but it won't let you make a move you're not allowed to make, or it shouldn't, and if it does, they consider that a bug. So board games really can't have tutorials the way video games do, where they force you to walk through the learning process, and in doing so, they teach you the game. Probably the closest I've seen, and again, I'm cribbing from this forum, is Gloomhaven Jaws of the Lion, where the first 5 missions teach you gently how to play Gloomhaven by showing you a new mechanism each game until you've played the 5 intro games, and then you know how the game works. I think this is a pretty good method, and probably the original Gloomhaven would benefit from maybe a print and play series of tutorials that did the same thing. I don't know how that would work. Maybe the original Gloomhaven could, well, probably now the way it works is if you want to play Gloomhaven, people suggest buy Jaws of the Lion first, play your way through that, then you know how to play Gloomhaven, and you can go play Gloomhaven. And later Frosthaven. Woo! But I think this is the place. Learning games, teaching games is the place where the hobby still has the longest to go and the most to grow. But I think there is a hard limit. This is the place where I bump up against people saying like, oh, we should have a tutorial, or games are too hard, blah, blah, blah. And it's that there is board games, part of what's fun about them is learning to play. Part of what's interesting is wrestling with how they work, learning the new system, coming to understand it, to use the Heinlein word, grok the new system, and then be able to enjoy it with your friends and family. That challenge is delightful and interesting and difficult and fun. And so it's that kind of thing that I'm really hoping to be able to do more of this year. But as a game designer and person who's got a couple publishing opportunities in the next couple of years, I'm also wrestling with this question of how do I teach people my game? What is the best way to get people over the hump to learn how to play our game so they can enjoy it and hopefully be happy with the money they've spent and then come and buy some more games from us? It is an eternal problem, and one that board game designers have been wrestling with for a long time, and one that has to do with making our community more welcome. Well, hopefully the second half of that was more fun now that I took off my mask. I hope the first half is usable. I may have to just scrap this whole episode, in which case you aren't hearing me talk right now. But I hope that you are, in which case thank you for joining me for another season. This is episode 300 after all. So this is the last episode of season 4 of the podcast. And season 3. It's the last episode of season 3 of the podcast. And in about a week and a half, I will start on season 4 with episode 301. We'll do our best of 2019 game roundup. We'll do some predictions or conversations about games that are coming up in 2021. And of course, lots of more shooting from the hip reviews and message from the deep reviews and commentary on culture and everything else you've come to love on Pick Up and Deliver. If you've enjoyed this season, please do tell a friend so that when we start up season 4, we're gathering more friends for our walks. If you have ideas for shows or topics that you'd like to see me cover or topics you'd like to see me return to, I would love to hear those. You can share all those ideas in one of 3 ways. You can reach out to me by email, brendan@rattleboxgames.com. You can send me a geek mail over on Board Game Geek. My username there is Wombat929. Or finally, you can hop on the Board Game Geek Guild forum, Guild 3269, where you can share any of your thoughts about this episode or the whole season, and join me in looking forward to next season. I would love to hear from you there or any of those places I've mentioned. That's about it for me this season. Thanks for joining me. I hope that your next walk is as pleasant as mine was. Take care. Bye-bye.
Brought to you by Rattlebox Games.